United States Senate. The views presented here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of this cable system. This is Coast to Coast with United States Senator John Seymour, a public affairs program designed to keep Californians informed on issues that affect the state and the country. Now, from the nation's capital, here is the host of Coast to Coast.
Hello and welcome to Coast to Coast. I'm Senator John Seymour. In 1990, the United States spent $65 billion on imported oil. Yet it took a war in the Persian Gulf and skyrocketing gasoline prices to remind Americans of our heavy reliance on imported oil. Almost a year after American soldiers were sent to Saudi Arabia and $87 billion spent for 8 months of foreign oil and gas, the energy crisis is on a back burner again. Here to talk about why this country runs so hot and cold on energy issues is Henson Moore. He's the Deputy Secretary of Energy. Thank you for joining me, Henson.
Senator, I'm glad to be here.
You know, I was greatly discouraged, as I'm sure you were, last month when the Senate refused to take up the energy bill. It seemed to me that it was just one more situation or case of non-performance by the Senate. Been unable to move a crime bill, unable to move a transportation bill, unable to move an energy bill. Why is that energy bill so important?
Well, that energy bill is very, very important. As you well know, as you were one of the architects of the bill when it came out of the committee, you supported it. You stood up and voted to debate the bill. That took courage because there are people who are opposed to it because it has some controversy in it. And a lot of senators ducked it. They didn't do what you did. They said, oh, why should I vote on something this controversial? Let's see if we can just bury it, not have to face it. You, as a freshman senator facing election next year, stood up and were counted and said, this is important to the country, let's bring it up and vote on it. The reason why it's important to the country is we're never going to get away from imported oil. We're never going to solve our environmental problems. We're never going to create jobs in this country unless we start doing something about it. This bill creates 315,000 jobs around the country. This bill will reduce imported oil use as a transportation fuel in this country dramatically. This bill will help the environment and things like global climate change dramatically. This bill does really pretty much everything you can do legislatively to tackle the problem. And to do that, there's some tough things in there, as you well know. And a lot of senators just didn't have the courage you did and don't want to debate it. We're trying to get it brought back up again. Yeah. If we had a majority of senators like you, that debate would be ongoing right now, and the country might have a bill by now.
Well, you know, Henson, one of the key components of that bill focuses around the question of shall we continue to be dependent upon imported oil or shall we have domestic production? And then, as you know, that debate focuses on this question of shall we explore and drill for oil in Alaska. It's my understanding that 46% of our entire country's petroleum demand has been met by imports between January and September of this year, as compared to only 36% of imports back in the Arab oil embargo of 1973. In other words, things are getting worse. Some say, some of my constituents in California say, give up the fight. Just rely on imported oil. Why do you think that, why shouldn't we give up the fight?
Well, you're not giving up the fight, and we're not going to give it up either. We saw the Persian Gulf War as one example of why you don't give up the fight. If we're heavily dependent on something that's so important to our way of life and our economy, such as oil, as a feedstock in the chemical industry, as a fuel to generate electricity, as well as a transportation fuel. We make plastics from it and chemicals and all of that. If we're so dependent upon insecure sources of oil that we've got to be willing and ready to send troops around the world, that's one reason. The second reason is our balance of trade. About 50% of our deficit in the balance of trade, meaning money, more money we're sending overseas to buy stuff than we're bringing back, about half of that deficit's imported oil. We ought to be spending money here, not in Saudi Arabia, not in the Persian Gulf. And thirdly, the third reason for it is that simply the economy of this country is always going to be subject to a price shock, subject to a disruption like we saw in '79. We didn't see it this time, thank goodness. We had a strategic petroleum reserve. We had early military successes that protected the flow of oil. We could have had a problem like '79 when businesses couldn't get it and prices went up. One reason why the economy right now isn't stronger than it is we're still paying for the little price shock that we had in December of last year, as you remember, when the price of oil hit $40 a barrel.
Right.
It hurt business in this country, and business hasn't yet been able to get over that. That's one of the reasons why we're having the problems we are.
Well,
So those are the reasons. It's good for our economy. It's not good for our economy, rather, to be importing that much. It's certainly not good for our security, and it's certainly not good for the American people's standard of living.
Well, you make a very good argument for production domestically. On the other hand, then the question is where? Where shall we seek this domestic production? And you and I respectfully disagree. As you know, as to drilling off the coast of California, as you know, I successfully put an amendment in the bill that would ban offshore oil and exploration off the coast of California until the year 2000. And of course, I find myself at odds with my own president on that question. But the question is where? And ANWR, or in Alaska, is one of the alternatives. The question we even have on that, though, is it's environmentally sensitive, ANWR as an area, and therefore we don't want to endanger that. What would you say to those who say we shouldn't drill in or explore in Alaska because of the environmental concerns?
I'd say if those concerns were real, they're absolutely right. The President did take most of the areas of the west coast of the United States off limits for drilling until the year 2000. There were some areas in California that your amendment covered that the President didn't, because we all have concerns that we don't know enough about the environment of those areas yet, and we won't know enough until the year 2000. So we shouldn't be drilling there till we know what we're doing. In the case of ANWR, we've been operating for 20 years right next door in Prudhoe Bay. Same terrain, the exact same topography. You can see the two oil fields, I mean, from one another. There's not a difference there. We've had 177 studies done that show there's not going to be permanent damage to flora or fauna. And so there's not a matter of, but we know what we're dealing with there. We've even improved the technology. We're even willing to have written into the rules and regulations of drilling up there the tightest in history anywhere in the world. We are confident now that we can operate up there safely for the environment. We can require everything to be removed when it's finished, and we know we're not going to do anything to upset that environment by our past history and by what we now know by our science studies. We don't have that for other areas of the country, such as the OCS of California. The amount of oil that's up there, Senator, we believe, from the figures we have now, and there's only one way to find it out, that's going to drill a few more wells and determine that that may be the second biggest oil find in the history of this country. Now, we can't afford just to lock that up when environmentally it's not going to cause any damage and import that amount of oil from Saudi Arabia. What is that going to do to our economy and to our jobs in this country and to being subject to future price shocks? That is madness. If there's a problem up there environmentally, we shouldn't do it. And we're simply saying, bring us your studies, your information that says there is one. Right now, all of our studies show there's not. And in something that I've not seen the California legislature do, the people in Alaska are as concerned about their environment as the people in California are theirs. Can you believe in a bipartisan vote of their legislature, unanimous, 100% of both their houses say they want to open that up for drilling? Now, if there was an environmental problem up there, I doubt we'd get a unanimous vote of both houses of their legislature.
Well, and I'd add, Henson, that the question was on the ballot for the people of Alaska to vote on, and I think somewhere around 2/3 of the people of Alaska voted in favor of exploration in ANWR. Moving off the domestic oil.
By the way, the Indians that live up there strongly support it.
Yes, the
And
Catcovics.
they opposed, yes. Those Indians opposed the drilling at Prudhoe Bay originally. They were afraid what it might do to the environment. After 20 years later now, they're some of the strongest supporters. They've seen, we know what you can do, we know you're going to do it right. We live here, the only people who live there.
Right.
And they say they're absolutely in support.
Well, when I visited Alaska and ANWR, I met with the Catcovic Indians, and they said to me, Senator, we know you're from California, but this is our land. Let us explore. But moving off of oil for a moment, some have said that the national energy strategy is put forth by the administration is weak on the development of alternative fuels. There are some, as you know, Henson, that wish we could just flip a switch and we wouldn't use oil anymore. Now, I know that's impractical. You know that's impractical. We're going to have to wean ourselves away from oil. That gets us to alternative fuels. What do you say to those who charge that the President's National Energy Strategy doesn't put enough emphasis on alternative fuels?
Well, they're not reading the bill. You know better. You sat there on it. As a matter of fact, you offered an amendment that even strengthened the provisions in the bill on this. That bill requires all public and private fleets by the year 1995 to move to alternative fuels. That's private fleets of automobiles, state, federal fleets of automobiles. That will create a market of some 3 million automobiles around the country using alternative fuels, which in turn will create a demand that will cause the manufacturers to begin to build these vehicles in big numbers, to bring the cost down to them, and to have them then ready to really be bought by the average consumer. And so this bill takes the first positive step towards requiring that. There's no other legislation in the country that requires it. And so this legislation does more for alternative fuels than anything else. And as I say, you offered an amendment to even strengthen that, even make it even tougher to get to that. And so this bill does it. And the people who claim it doesn't do enough, I guess there's some people who claim you never do enough, and you simply ask them, all right, what's your solution? Where's your alternative? And as you well know, the only person that offered an amendment to make that tougher was you in that committee. Nobody else had any suggestions how to make it tougher. You did, and that amendment was accepted.
Henson, another bone of contention in this bill is what they commonly refer to as CAFE standards, meaning if you take the average fleet of vehicles, used automobiles, used throughout the country, today there's a standard that says those vehicles must be built so that they will get a minimum average of 27.5 miles to the gallon. Now, one of the bones of contention is, shall we or shall we not raise that from 27.5 miles a gallon to 40 miles per gallon? And there's arguments on both sides. Some of the people who don't want to see domestic oil production are saying the only way you'll ever see domestic oil production is if you work on the other half of the equation, which is to increase those CAFE standards to 40 miles to the gallon. What's the administration's position on that?
Our position is that this president, when he became president in 1989, increased the standard from 27 to 27.5. He is willing to do it again under existing law. The minute we have the reports in from the National Academy of Sciences telling us how much we can realistically increase it to, and that we have the technology to build an automobile that's safe that can do that. Now, we can build a car right now that gets 50 miles a gallon. The Geo, for instance, that's on the market right now, will do that. Not everybody's buying the Geo. We just had crash tests done by the Department of Transportation, of which you're aware, that show if you find a big car hitting a Geo, or I shouldn't say a Geo, but a very small car on a California freeway, guess who's going to get hurt, and hurt rather badly. And so at this particular point, the President is saying, I'm willing to raise that standard without any additional law. The minute I know how much science tells me it can be done by technology without making the vehicle smaller and lighter. Otherwise, you're increasing the personal injury risk very severely to people who may be injured in automobiles, between the large ones still on the road today and many large ones being sold today versus the smaller vehicles that could achieve that 40 miles a gallon. In other words, if we can build a car that'll do that, that's roughly the same size car we have today, the President will order it done. If we can't do that, he's not going to do it because of the danger. Now, somebody may say, well, why don't you get all the big cars off the road? Well, stop and think about that for a minute. Somebody watching this telecast may have such a car, and we're telling you that you got to go turn that car in right now, or we're going to buy it from you, or we're going to force you to give it up. We're getting into a very complex situation that really is something we don't want to get into. We know that technologically, we think that 20 years from now, 15 years from now, we're going to have whole new concepts in generation of engines to where we'll be solving that problem without going about it building unsafe cars. We're working on a gas turbine engine that will give you 40% greater efficiency. We just may have that in the marketplace in another 10 to 15 years. We're working on the battery consortium to build electric vehicles, particularly for cars used within inner cities such as Los Angeles and other areas, that we think that we may have that by the turn of the century, which will eliminate fuel altogether. And so we're working at these problems. What we're afraid of now is that if certain senators want an easy vote to look like to their people they're doing something to save oil, by ordering vehicles to go to a higher standard. What they've got to understand is they may be ordering those vehicles to be very much more unsafe than they are today. And that's the reason why the President's held up thus far.
Getting back to the CAFE standard, from what I hear from some of my colleagues in this battle over whether there shall be domestic oil production in Canada versus setting these standards, CAFE standards, to 40 miles to the gallon. It may be that when we bring this bill back up, and I hope we bring the bill back up in January and get on with it, it may be that there will be attempts to forge a compromise somewheres on those two bones of contention, oil production on one hand, CAFE standards on the other. Do you think there's any possibility there might be some receptivity on part of the administration if, in fact, the CAFE standard were raised, maybe not to 40, but to some compromise number, but yet not directed? Set that as a goal and say to the Department of Transportation, that's the goal we'd like to see you hit within the bounds of having safe vehicles as well as the other concerns. Might that be considered or thrown out on the table for a potential compromise?
It just may. We're going to have to listen to our floor leaders and people like you. And when we get this bill back up in January and you tell us and you tell the President what your best judgment is, we're able to accomplish on the Senate floor, then we'll have to consider that. We think it's a little early for us in the administration to say how we'll compromise on the bill until the bill is up and moving, and you as our floor leader and floor leaders come to us and tell us, now look, if you want the bill, this is what you're going to have to do to be able to make this thing work. And so we'll be listening to you. We get the bill up and you give us your best guesstimate of what it's going to take. We'll have to consider that.
Air quality is also a concern, and a real great concern in California. As you know, the state of California led the country in establishing the Clean Air Act and setting very, very high standards. One of the greatest contributors to the smog that we have in California is the old gas guzzler. That old gas guzzler just creates more smog and burns more gasoline, just worsening the problem. There have been some private sector attempts to try to provide incentives for trading in the gas guzzler, getting rid of it. Has there been any consideration given to a concept that maybe there be a tax credit given to the owner of a gas guzzler if they'll trade their car in and buy a new fuel-efficient automobile?
Yes, there has been. And of course it's not in this bill because under the Constitution, any bill dealing with taxes has to start in the House of Representatives, and this energy bill has started in the Senate. So right now there are no tax components to it. But we have studied that. People are talking about that. The National Energy Strategy, not this legislative part of it, but the National Energy Strategy, the total document, the total study, the total work piece, does talk about trying to find a way to work with local governments to get the gas guzzlers off the road. You can do more to help the environment and also to reduce the amount of oil being consumed that way than you can with a CAFE standard. Because if we were to get, and they will as they begin to wear out, if you look at the year 2000, the fleet average is going to go up very dramatically, just as these older inefficient vehicles go off the road and people are buying the vehicles we're building today. It's going to go up dramatically. And if you could exacerbate that, if you could speed that up, you'd do more to help the environment and do more to help the consumption of reducing the consumption of imported oil in this country than you would by ordering the automaker 10 years from now to build a car that reaches 40 miles a gallon. Yeah. You ought to be putting the same effort on this problem, and we can do more with it. And so we think you're onto something with that idea, and we look forward to being able to work with you and members of the Senate and the House to see what can be fashioned to find a way to cause this to happen.
You know, in another area, a very exciting area as far as I'm concerned, because if we can push this particular agenda, it seems to me we may be able to have our cake and eat it too, so to speak. What I'm talking about is some of the reformulated gasolines that have been coming out on the market. I think it was ARCO that led the field on that, followed by Mobil, and back east here, Amoco now is advertising this reformulated gasoline that cuts emissions by somewhere 25–30%. You have any thoughts as to how we might provide incentive or encourage that not only the research in cleaner burning gasoline fuels, but the consumer to use this reformulated gasoline, which, as I understand, may cost 10 cents a gallon more, or I don't know, 5–10 cents a gallon more. Is there something that we might do at the federal level to provide greater incentive for the usage of reformulated fuels?
The alternative fuels provisions in the bill that you have supported will create a demand for vehicles that use some of these alternative fuels, which helps. Now, the reformulated fuel can be used by any vehicle being used today. That, we want to be very careful we don't do anything that eliminates the possibility of that reformulated fuel coming on the market. And we think at this point, either by regulation or by proposed law, we've not, that is going to be allowed to come into the marketplace and be used. The Congress could consider, I suppose, a law that would ban fuels other than, or to start ordering that all fuels, like when we went from leaded fuel to unleaded fuel, it could begin to require that. We would rather see that done at the state level at this particular point, if that's going to be done, because it may well be that the fuel mixture needed for California is different than the one needed for New Orleans. And it may well be that Californians can determine that for purposes of air quality, that maybe the air quality mix is different in New Orleans. But certainly that is something to be looked at. And you're right, the gasoline industry, led by ARCO in particular, seems to be making real breakthroughs in terms of developing of new fuels. And those fuels may well be more new fuels based on gasoline. Those fuels may be more expensive, but they also may have real advantages for us in terms of the environment. In some cases, those fuels are a little less efficient in the sense that you're having to use a better part of the oil, and you're having more of that oil not going into gasoline. So that's one of the reasons why the expense is there. You got to find something else to do with that balance of the oil that you were making gasoline from. Right. Therefore, it costs you more. But if it gives us improvement in the environment, that's something the consumers need to know, and we need to consider then, how do we then, can consumer choice do it, or is there some necessity in the government getting involved to mandate it?
You touched earlier in our conversation on electric cars. Do you have some idea when Californians might be in a position to purchase an electric car that'll really take them where they want to go, that will be affordable in its cost? How far out in the future is that?
I think we're looking at about a decade, maybe a little bit less. Now, I read recently that the California's looking to have some electric cars in the market before then. And you can buy the cars now, they exist now, but you put your finger on it. Is the car really going to be a functional automobile? Is it going to be one we can afford, or is it one that just simply uses electricity? There have been cars around for some time that just use electricity, but they have not met those tests you set. Right now, the best batteries for an electric car cost about $2,500. Those batteries have about a 2-year lifespan, and those batteries only have about a 120-mile range, or about a 100-mile range. That doesn't really meet the test you're talking about. Right. We think by the turn of the century, maybe sooner, by virtue of this battery consortium that we've announced, we'll have that problem licked. And we'll be the first in the world, our automobile manufacturers in this country, to have a real electric car that has a 250, 300-mile range, and that a battery doesn't cost that much. And you can plug it in overnight, it can completely recharge, you're ready to go again the next day. They've built the car. I've driven the car. The car is superb, 0 to 60 faster than a gasoline car.
Is that right?
A fine automobile. They built the car. We just got to lick the battery problem. And that's what we're now coming together in a real, almost like a Manhattan project. That's the way we're going about dealing with this problem now, to solve that battery problem.
Well, that's very exciting. We had discussed earlier alternative fuels, and you were very generous to remind me that I was successful in getting that amendment into the bill that said to government, look, we want to see alternative fuels used. Government ought to take the lead, and therefore the fleets of automobiles owned by government, they ought to be really moving aggressively into alternative fuels. How will that impact the federal government and the federal agencies, the fleet of federal vehicles versus state government's vehicles and local government vehicles? How will that impact the federal fleet of vehicles?
The President had ordered by an executive order that we begin doing that when he released his executive order, I think in about March. And your amendment requires us to do it by law. We've already started on that. To give you an example, we have one compressed natural gas vehicle, one alternative fuel vehicle in the Department of Energy. We'll have 50 in March. And we'll have announcements coming out over the next several months of various air bases and military bases where we're converting their fleets of vehicles to alternative fuels. And so we're moving out on it right now. There are problems. It costs money. They're more expensive than a normal vehicle. We don't get warranties on these vehicles just yet. And we've got to be careful about which alternative fuel we select is one that there are refueling infrastructure in that area, or we have to then get into the building of that. But all of this will happen, and all of this is happening. This legislation, your amendment, what we're doing, will make it happen a whole lot sooner than it would otherwise happen.
How far in the future do you think, how long will it take, if government will take the lead on these alternative fueled vehicles, how long will it take before, because we've got so many vehicles in government, the federal level, the state level, the local level, how long before we'd create a market in which Detroit, Michigan,
start responding to it?
Yes.
I'd say next year.
Is that right?
I think just that
quick?
fast. And I think they're already getting, Ford's already talking about building alternative fuel vehicles. GM is talking about building an alternative fuel or a compressed natural gas fired truck commercially to go on the market. And so when they see this legislation, if that legislation with your amendment will pass, that sends a signal right away to the automakers that there's now a market for these. They're already beginning to hear it, and we're already beginning to buy it. It's already beginning to go on in spots across the country. But when you make it a national law, then people are really going to begin to see it. The automakers will respond very quickly. So I'd say you'd see vehicles, the 94, 95 models, wouldn't be too soon to start seeing that happen.
Well, that's very exciting. You know, the other byplay of all that activity is when those cars become used cars, alternative fuel used cars, there's a whole secondary market that then gets absorbed into the citizenry,
Yes.
into the average person. Well, that's going to be very exciting. Well, we've about gone through this half hour, and very quickly I want to commend you for your leadership. I know it hasn't been easy. I know that it's got to be very frustrating for you to see the goal line in implementing a national energy strategy and watching Congress, and in our case the United States Senate, sort of fumble around and just not grab the bull by the horns and move ahead. And I just want you to know you're doing a super job.
Well, Senator, I thank you. Our job is easier than yours. We sit down and can come up with what we think are the right policies, but it takes somebody with brains and courage to vote for them. And so we thank you.
Well, Mr. Secretary, our half hour is gone. And I want to thank you again for stopping by and telling our viewers out in California and about the country's energy concerns. I'm Senator John Seymour. Thanks for watching Coast to Coast.
This has been Coast to Coast with U.S. Senator John Seymour. If you have questions or comments about this program, please write to Senator John Seymour, 367 Dirksen Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. 20510. Coast to Coast was produced in Washington, D.C. using facilities of the United States Senate. The views presented here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of this cable system.